Good evening. My name is Jay Hamilton, and as chair of the Department of Communication, I am fortunate tonight to introduce Provost Persis Drell. Provost Drell announced recently that she will be stepping down from her position as the university's chief academic and budget officer. She is famous for making hard trade-offs in a budget that reached $8.9 billion for next year. For the Department of Communication, the decisions made by the provost have translated into 5 fully funded summers for our PhD students, which means they could stay here and do their own research. During the pandemic era, Provost Drell extended the tenure clock of our junior faculty and reduced their teaching loads and gave them additional financial assistance. Because of the Ideal Fellowship program that she founded, our department next year will host a scholar studying the use of algorithms in the criminal justice system. And in a time when a faculty member is just one inept or maladroit comment away from being the feature on Twitter or TikTok or even Fizz, Provost Drell has championed policies that protect academic freedom and the discussion of controversial ideas on campus, which makes her the perfect person to introduce tonight's McClatchy Symposium. Please join me in welcoming her.
Well, good evening, and it is just my pleasure to welcome you to the 56th Carlos Kelly McClatchy Symposium. And we are very fortunate, I believe, to have Will McClatchy, their Stanford class, the great class of 1984, here this evening. And I want to thank you for all the McClatchy family has done to support the study of journalism at Stanford. And thanks to all of you for joining us at this event. Now, when Jay asked me to give opening remarks for tonight's event, and truth be told, I actually think I volunteered when I heard who was going to be here. I was really delighted because the topic, opinion writing in a polarized age, is of particular interest to me. As you've no doubt been following, universities have come under a lot of scrutiny around issues of academic freedom, freedom of speech, and efforts to advance an inclusive and diverse environment. And as I'm sure you've all noticed, we at Stanford have been in the headlines recently on this issue. But it's an extraordinarily important issue. And if we need to be in the headlines, so be it. I believe there is a misplaced narrative that there is a fundamental conflict between having an inclusive environment and support for academic freedom and free speech. Academic freedom is the principle that lies at the heart of the university. Our very mission of teaching and research depends on total freedom of inquiry, thought, expression, and publication. But how does this play out in the real-world classroom? How do we set norms that we can explore so that we can explore that freedom of inquiry and remain inclusive and welcoming to all of our students? How do we foster challenging conversations that are respectful and productive? And how do we embrace the concept that classrooms are not going to be safe spaces where ideas and speech are constrained, but rather spaces where we meaningfully engage with difficult and controversial issues? And as if that weren't enough, how in the process do we promote honest, civil, and productive dialogue across difference that we can all learn from rather than shutting people down or making it unwelcome for them to voice views that are different from majority opinions? Now, in this current hyperpolarized political environment, I embrace the examples where I think this kind of dialogue is happening. One of those is the conversation between Bret Stephens and Gail Collins in the New York Times, which happens to be one of my favorite reads. In the last few years, Bret and Gail have discussed just about every controversial subject you can think of, whether it's the presidency or the Supreme Court or gun violence or the war in Ukraine. They've disagreed more than they've agreed. Would you, you support that? But they've done it with respect and passion and courage and humility and humor. And they've made nuanced and cogent arguments while holding each other's feet to the fire. And whereas I might not always agree with one or the other on a particular issue, I do really respect the fact that they've done their homework, they make convincing arguments, and those arguments are based on facts and data. Now, writing opinion pieces in our current political climate may feel like there's a target on your back, but you don't get a Pulitzer Prize winning, you don't get to be a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist without ruffling a few feathers or by trying to make everyone like you. Bret Stephens has done his share of feather ruffling. I'm not sure everybody likes him, but both at the Wall Street Journal and at the New York Times, he has been considered a thoughtful, albeit somewhat conservative voice. He won't be put in a silo, and I hope I'm quoting you correctly, I've been a contrarian all my life for as long as I can remember. His many contributions to high quality, accurate, and thoughtful reporting and analysis are much appreciated and much needed in today's world. He's a personal hero for me for his willingness to engage thoughtfully on the most difficult topics and to help all of us, especially those of us who disagree with him, to learn. And now it's an honor to welcome Janine Zacharia to the stage. She's actually already sitting here. Janine is the Carlos Kelly McClatchy Lecturer in Stanford's Department of Communications, and she will give Bret a proper introduction and lead tonight's discussion. Thank you.
The 2013 Pulitzer Prize winner for distinguished commentary, Bret Stephens, joined the New York Times as a columnist in 2017 after a long career with the Wall Street Journal, where he served as deputy editorial page editor and as a foreign affairs columnist. Before that, he was the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, where he and I worked together, in fact. He has reported from around the world and interviewed scores of world leaders, and is the author of the prescient 2014 book, America in Retreat, The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder. He's also going to be the class speaker at his alma mater, I believe, right? The University of Chicago this week. And in that announcement, I was reminded that you are the founder of the Renewed Democracy Initiative. Now, why I was particularly interested in this, Bret, was because just this past week, the Freeman Spogli Institute announced that they've launched the Stanford Democracy Initiative, which seeks to understand what members of our community are doing to defend and advance democratic norms and practices in the US and globally. So in preparation for today, and it's very good to see you, I've been reading, or more often rereading, dozens of your columns. It's interesting to do that all in one sitting. And sometimes I was shaking my head this way, and sometimes I was shaking my head. Sometimes I was holding my head, and sometimes I was just laughing out loud. Because you know your way around a sentence, as you know, and you have a gift for bringing extraordinary humor, and sometimes of the self-deprecating sort, to the most serious and controversial topics. And I picked out two themes that seem to be animating you most these days. One, we aren't doing enough to help Ukraine. And two, Trump is the gravest threat to American democracy, your words. Of course, you care deeply about Israel, are chilled about the rise of anti-Semitism. You don't think universities are doing a great job of educating our students in the art of debate and discussion. You're worried about academic freedom. You've had it with conservatives who excuse Trump's behavior. You worry about Taiwan. And in one column, at least, you worried that the country might become like California. It's pretty nice here, though, I have to say. The sun's beating down.
You know, I write a lot, so I can't account for everything I've said over the years.
And I want to dive into these issues, but first I want to start, and I'm so excited to discuss with you, with the craft, which is what you are. You are the craft of the opinion writer. And I want to start with a quote from one of my most resonant quotes from my bookshelf. And I think it was a gift from Professor Glasser, who I see in the back. So see if you can guess what year this quote is from. Not you, Ted, though, because you'll know. Quote, "One dreadful curse of contemporary life is the terrifying flood of words with which the agencies of mass communication threaten to inundate the citizen. Anybody with nothing to say can say it by mass communication." Anybody want to guess roughly what year that was written? Yeah, not you, Ted. Ballpark, my students? Bret?
I'm guessing 1919.
A few decades off. Matt? No? Okay, so it's from 1947, okay, from this book, A Free and Responsible Press, A General Report on Mass Communication. And, you know, obviously we don't use the phrase mass communication that much, but it just strikes me as sort of relevant for what we're going to talk about today. So Bret, to just kick us off, what is the role now of the columnist in this age, what I call the era of noise in a way, when everybody with an opinion can sort of express it, share it? How do you see your role in this, what I call really cacophony?
It's changed. First of all, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for coming today. It's a real honor to be out here. And for all the stuff I say about other parts of California, this looks awfully nice. The role for me personally has changed. It particularly changed when I went to the Wall Street Journal, where I was a mostly right-of-center columnist writing for a mostly right-of-center audience. By the way, how am I doing?
I think we should switch to hand mics.
Is this driving you crazy too?
It's going to drive me crazy, yeah.
All right. So,
If it's possible to use that one.
why don't I just take your mic?
Yeah, we'll just share,
We'll share.
so we get it organized.
There are two roles for a columnist. The typical role is to rally. You rally the people on your side by essentially putting into words what they inchoately feel, think. And when I was at the Wall Street Journal, time and again, people who at least agreed with me would say, "Oh, you say just what I think, you just say it so much better." And it was a nice compliment, but the job was really essentially to make opinion on your side cohere around a certain set of ideas, phrases, expressions, fact sets. I moved to the New York Times 6 years ago, where 99.9% of my audience doesn't agree with me. And there, the best I can ask for is to persuade, but not even to fully persuade people to come over to my side. What I'd like to make them do is stop and think and say, I can see that. Or that's the best argument I've heard from a point of view that I don't agree with because my value set is different. And I think that's actually an especially useful function now because we live in an era where our default assumption about people on the other side of the political divide is that they're stupid and or sinister. And breaking through that stereotype, I think, is a useful civic function. I think it helps repair the frayed edges of democracy. To be able to say, you know, Stephens, he's wrong, but the guy stops and makes me think. By the way, Paul Krugman serves that function for me because I think he's a superb polemicist. He's obviously a very smart economist. I don't agree, but I never miss a thing that Paul writes because I know I'm going to have to stop, think, and ask myself, well, why is that wrong? Where exactly, where does the fault lie with that argument? And so he's performing the function of essentially being the whetstone to my knife. He's sharpening my thinking, which I mean, I'm not trying to kill anyone. I'm just trying to come up with a better argument, just to be clear. And that's not only a useful and essential function, but I think it's increasingly a dying one. I gave a talk in Australia a few years ago, and I titled it "The Dying Art of Disagreement." To disagree well is an art form, because in order to disagree well, you first have to understand well. You have to so thoroughly have digested the viewpoint of the opposing side that you've chewed it up, you can spit it right back, you can make the argument of the other side better than that side can make it itself. And that's a form of argumentation that's called proleptic. It comes from the Greek prolepsis. And it's very, very important. When you think of the course of, I mean, at least in the Western tradition, what is the Western tradition? It's a series of spectacularly intelligent disagreements. So Aristotle disagrees with Plato, and then you have Locke disagreeing with Hobbes and Rousseau disagreeing with both Locke and Hobbes. Nietzsche disagreeing with everyone, and Wittgenstein disagreeing with himself. It's a series of these disagreements that are illuminating because every single character in the story is correctly assessing what has come before. And just very briefly, one of the things that I find dispiriting is I'll sometimes make the mistake of reading the comments on my column. And even worse, reading the Twitter comments on the column. But I'll sometimes read these comments, and there was a wonderful line attributed to the physicist Wolfgang Pauli. He once reproved a very bad student by saying, "You're not even wrong." And I look at these comments, I'm like, they're not even wrong. They're not even engaging in what it is that I am saying. They're so instantly moving to a caricature of the argument they think I've made that they've missed the point entirely. And so we have to get back to, what I think of as the role of a columnist at its best is making arguments that are so precise, so persuasive, that we once again engage this art of disagreement, which is, I think, the biggest problem right now in democracies.
Mark's going to bring you a mic. I really want to get into this, how you deal with the comments thing. That's later in my script, but let's just do it now. So I always joke that if you take a walk in my inbox from when I covered Israel, my email inbox, it's very quaint compared to what people, in terms of the feedback I used to get or the criticism. And sometimes, people would write and criticize, and I would occasionally, I mostly ignore, delete, whatever, and then sometimes I would write, "Thank you for your feedback." And it was very disarming for people. But in general, I had a rule of not engaging beyond that. You have chosen to engage sometimes with your critics. Where are you on that?
To my undying regret.
Yeah, so that's why you didn't take my feedback, you didn't take my guidance on this. So, I remember we discussed it, but anyway.
No, unfortunately, it's not a smart thing to do, because a lot of criticism is fundamentally in bad faith, and there's the goal is, I owned so and so, whether it's Tom Friedman or Bret Stephens or name the columnist. That's the game that's being played, and I think it suggests, look, I'm aware that if you're the sort of person, and I'm sorry if I'm insulting anyone in the audience, if you're the sort of person who's busy writing comments on the comment section, like, get a life, go do something better, take up fishing or chess, something more productive. But there's been a kind of, I think, a degradation in terms of the engagement between the writer and his audience. And I'll give you an example. So my late father couldn't stand Anthony Lewis. My dad was a moderate Republican, but very hawkish on foreign policy, and he thought Anthony Lewis was just hopelessly naive when it came to the Soviet Union. But there were two things about my dad. Number one, he always read Anthony Lewis, and this is something that no longer happens. If you just presumptively disagree with the New York Times, you just stop reading them. You're just watching, Bret Baier and Sean Hannity and those characters. My father always read Lewis. And number two, he once actually met him, and he said, well, he's actually quite a nice guy, right? So he was able to detach the opinion from the person. He was able to imagine that a person who seems likable and decent nonetheless has opinions that he dislikes. And I think that is something that has changed in the relationship between a lot of readers and writers. They either worship you and think you're the greatest thing because they agree with you, or they assume that because you disagree with them and vice versa, that you're a bad person, and your motives are sinister. And that's a real problem in terms of that particular relationship. This is one of the reasons I enjoy doing events like this, because I'm sure most of you, or probably most of you, don't agree with what I have to say. Maybe you'll come away from this event and think, well, he's not a total, jerk. I hope.
So you wrote a piece a few years ago where you gave tips to aspiring op-ed writers, and I know we have some in the audience probably as well. It's something I assign when I do some op-ed writing workshops on campus and off campus sometimes. And you distinguished between the op-ed contributor, who's generally a specialist in their area, and the columnist, the regular column who comments. I don't know, how often do you write? Biweekly, once a week? Biweekly?
The column is once a week, and
then
then the conversation, so it's 2 bylines per
yeah.
week.
So in contrast to the op-ed writer, the columnist is, quote, a generalist, often with an idiosyncratic style, who performs for his readers. What do you mean by performing?
So when I'm Bret Stephens, the columnist, it's a voice that I've developed over a long period of time, and it is an aspect of my personality, but it's not my entire personality. I'm not, as you know, Janine, the super confident, always witty, whatever, know-it-all that I am in my column, right? But you work on developing a personal style, right? I mean, if you meet Tom Friedman, he's not the same Tom Friedman that you know from his column, who has 3 theories about 4 continents involving 5 this, he's actually totally a normal, he's a normal human being. But he has this persona, and to some extent that is a kind of part of the art form of column writing, which is distinct from op-ed writing. If the provost were to write an op-ed, right?
Which I've often encouraged her to do.
Right, it would be based on her expertise as a scientist, as an administrator, as a person who knows her way around academia, and that's why you would read it. I wouldn't look for a particular voice, right? I would look for clarity in her style, but not a personality. But the way in which you go about developing a relationship with readers as a columnist is they kind of know you as a certain kind of person. And I think for some of my readers, I'm sure the personality I have is grating. Other people like it. But ultimately, it's the voice you have. You know what I'd liken it to? The moment you hear, I don't know, Keith Richards play a lick on a guitar, it's the Rolling Stones. That kind of fat, loud sound of his. Or The Edge from U2, much more precise. Right away, if you haven't heard the song, you're like, this has got to be a U2 song, because it has a certain sound. And a good columnist should have a sound, because writing is not just consumed by reading it. You hear it, and you can also speak it. And one of the things I do with every column is I will go someplace quiet and I will just read it aloud. I want it to sound a certain way. It's also a very good way, by the way, just as a pro tip, you will pick up minor infelicities, word repetitions, paragraphs that begin the same way, only when you read it out loud, that you won't see if you're just scanning the column itself.
I just made my thesis students, some of whom were here, do that the other day, read it out loud to us as a group. So at the 2017 McClatchy Symposium, it was on the future of foreign correspondence, and your colleague, Michael Slackman, the foreign editor, was there. And he basically stopped me in my tracks when he said, Janine, we shouldn't call this foreign correspondence. It's international reporting. We have to rename the whole thing, rename your class, et cetera. And I think about this a lot when I think about opinion, op-ed, the op-ed section. I try my hand every once in a while on op-ed, and I hate the word. Yeah. Because who cares what I think? They care what I know. And so I want to know what you think about changing the whole concept to the argument page as opposed to the opinion pages, in a way to explain to people part of my overall mission of how we're going to restore respect for journalism, or do you not like that idea? I see your face.
I think it's a bit of the Times went from op-ed, which is really a term of art, to opinion, making that much more explicit. And we did so after the Tom Cotton debacle, I guess is the only expression, only word for it, because so many readers who approach, especially younger readers who approach our product and have always approached it digitally, had a hard time understanding, A, what this term op-ed meant, and B, where the line was drawn between the opinion, and the views of the paper or the reporting of the paper. I'm happy with argument argument, opinion, so long as it's clear that the frame has moved from the objective to the subjective. That's, I think, the distinction that matters.
Do you get stressed having to come up with something once a week to comment on?
No, I mean, I've been doing this for so long. People ask me, like, how do you come up with this? The great challenge is figuring out what not to write about. I have been essentially a regular columnist for 21 years. And that's not so 21 years, you can do the math, about 50 columns, sometimes more per year. Also, when I was at the Wall Street Journal, I wrote hundreds of unsigned editorials. Like, it's not hard to write. The challenge is sort of deciding what is really timely, what should I be writing about this week, not next. Because, look, I mean, we shouldn't elevate this art form too much. I don't even know if it's an art form. I mean, I always think of what I do as basically like a short order cook delivering pancakes. Pancakes can be delicious if they are served hot, right? When you started out by saying, I've gone back and looked at your old columns, my heart sank, right? Because that's like giving someone pancakes from last week. I mean, they're disgusting.
Columns should be more like baking soda with a very long shelf life, don't you think?
I don't
know, like they like this pancake analogy.
You are engaging with a particular moment in time, and you are trying to serve it hot. And the biggest disappointments I have as a columnist is I'll write a column, and the next day I'll think, damn it, my column should have been on this other subject. And it's a particular challenge now because, unlike when both of us started in journalism, things can change between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. At night. And I have on some occasions had my editor call me at 5 p.m. when I've delivered the column. I just picked up my daughter from school, and he'll say, we could really use something real quick on whatever. The last time I did that happened with the Turkish earthquake. I had lived through the Mexico City earthquake of 1985 as a young child, and so I knew something about, and I lived through other bad earthquakes, and so I knew something about it. So I just sat down and in an hour and 15 minutes punched out a column. You can look back at it and you'll see it's not a perfectly honed column, but it was written really fast.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned was you mentioned the unsigned editorials. And a lot of newsrooms, American Press Institute has done some good convening on this, have reevaluated their editorial page in general. Some have drastically cut back on the number of editorials, including our own local San Francisco Chronicle, which only publishes editorials, unsigned editorials, when they have something to say about a topic. Which at first I was like, I kind of like the daily editorial, but now I'm like, that makes it maybe more powerful. What's your take on that? Whether you can still have impact with the editorials?
So I think some editorial pages some editorials, unsigned editorials, continue to have an impact. Paul Gigot, my former boss at the Wall Street Journal, is the master of the craft. You may hate the point of view, but those are master classes in short form argumentation. They are clear, they come at you with a single point of view, they are factual, they are crisply written, and they're immensely influential on the Republican conservative side of the aisle. When I came to the Times, I actually told James Bennett, I said we should do fewer editorials, but that's because I don't think the Times had a particular genius of the form. It requires a peculiar personality, which is that you're constantly writing these pieces which get attention and no name is attached to it. And so you need a person who has some kind of weirdly inverted ego where they're desperate to have their words in print and don't want to see their name in print. And it's just a particular type of person. Those people are out there, but they're kind of hard to find. And when I came to the Times, we didn't really have one. And so I think now when we do weigh in, it has more of an impact. The previous practice of 3 editorials a day, many of them excruciatingly dull, I don't think was serving the paper well.
Talk about the conversation, Provost Drell's favorite thing you do. Talk about how that works mechanically, the genesis. It looks like you have an awful lot of fun with Gail doing it.
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, Gail is the nicest person in the world. And nice is not the word. She's funny. She's droll. She's like cool. She's a great drinking companion. And people constantly say, are you friends in real life? We really are. It's not a shtick. We genuinely enjoy each other's company, and we socialize and with our spouses. Gail had actually been doing it with David Brooks prior to my arrival, and they didn't have chemistry for whatever reason. And then, so when I came, she sort of approached me and said, hey, would you do this thing with me? And I was like, and, you know, she's the former editorial page editor, so she's a kind of a senior figure at the paper. I thought, okay, well, I have to do this. And then slowly, initially we did it every other week, and then suddenly we noticed that people were really responding to it. And it turns out it is probably it is by far the single most popular opinion column in the paper, and our what's called the engagement rate, people who actually read it from start to finish, is mind-bogglingly high. It's a little bit like Golden Girls or those TV shows that no one can understand why they're so popular, but they're really popular. And it turns out, this is what's really fascinating about it. If you look for the conversation on social media, we are nowhere to be seen. No one on Twitter gives a damn about the conversation with Gail. There's just no comment about it. I looked for it. I think, is no one interested? And yet, Times readers love it. And again, what people tell me and they tell Gail is, I love the fact that you agree, you know how to disagree agreeably. I love the tone. I love the feeling that you actually like each other and that this kind of conversation is even possible in this day and age. And it's stunning that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people respond this way. And I think what it tells you is that the algorithm of outrage, which is the algorithm of, I'm sorry to say, this neck of the woods, up the street, down the street, is not necessarily what audiences really want. They want a really different kind of conversation. They want to be reminded that a certain kind of sweetness in tone and levity is something that should be part of their media diet. And all of the media is essentially geared to piss people off, right? That's the business model. Can Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow really piss people off tonight, right, about the sinister other side of the aisle? I think there is a hidden demand for a totally different way of approaching argument. And it's not agreeing, but it's disagreeing without bitterness.
I mean, it happened. I mean, we used to have Crossfire right back in the day. That was kind of still entertaining me. But at least you had people debating issues, right?
Yeah.
And so, one of the things, you're a proud, I think, alum of University of Chicago, and you've written or you said that it taught you there, you were educated in the importance of intellectual humility. Always more can be learned. You keep an open mind to a powerful counter-argument. Why, in general, is that harder now in our society, you think? Why is that not happening as much? Why are you saying that the conversation is an outlier?
I think it's because it's not taught. I mean, I don't know. This is not a great answer. The answer is I just, quien sabe, I don't really know. But I think part of it is that we have not, and I'm excluding Stanford and other select great universities.
No, we're talking about this, right? About how to do this better? Yeah.
But people feel that you should either not disagree, avoid disagreements, or when you have them, it's sort of lucha libre, fight to the death types of arguments. And I think part of it is there are few models. I mean, one of the great things about the University of Chicago is that in seminar after seminar, we were encouraged by our professors to, and this was the early 90s when I was in college, we were just encouraged to speak out and to figure out how to disagree intelligently, and also how to accept being humbled and even humiliated intellectually, that was okay. I remember there was a big guy in my dorm, he was like 6'4", and at one point I was in some argument in the dorm, I forgot what the subject was, and I was fumbling over my words, and he looked at me and he said, "Stephens, you have the verbal acuity of shampoo." And I mean, this has been 31 years, and I'm still.
You remember that? You remember that moment?
Dealing with,
Where is that
with
person now?
This trauma. I think he's an insurance executive somewhere. Sean Nixon. You can look him up somewhere. Not related to the president. But that was a very useful moment. It's not a bad thing, by the way, to be able to have those experiences in your life when you are put down and you're a little bit sore and wounded. It teaches you something, provided that here's, I think, the main point. How do you maintain a spirit of good faith? And I'm not quite sure if there's any formula for doing it. But the spirit of good faith means that you are offering whatever arguments you have, right or wrong, with the intention of improving the conversation, not cynically trying to destroy it or detract from it or reduce it. And a great professor will be able to elicit that sense in his or her classroom. And I witnessed it at the University of Chicago. I saw people bring that out. And even when people spoke poorly, so long as the spirit of the contribution is offered in good faith, then it's a valid one. I think one of the things that has happened now is that Twitter allows bad faith interpretations of good faith comments, and people are terrified of that bad faith critic humiliating or hurting them or damaging them for good. So that's another aspect of it.
Yeah. I know you said you didn't like that I read all your columns, but there was one that was pretty recent, so I think we're in the zone. So when you got hired by the New York Times, a lot of climate scientists wrote and said they were going to cancel their subscriptions. They were very angry about the columns you had written at the Journal about climate change. And I was impressed that in your columns, one of this intellectual humility you've talked about in general is that you acknowledge sometimes when you thought you were wrong. And one of them you said recently was when you described Trump voters as, quote, appalling. And another one is this corrective that you wrote in, I think, a 7,000-word piece for the New York Times in October about your trip to Greenland, and I guess someone else was here on the trip with you. And I was interested in a lot of aspects of this. One of the things was about how you got there, and the story of this person, John Englander. So just talk a little bit about that whole experience and this whole topic.
Well, I mean, when I got to the Times, north of 40,000 people signed petitions. You can now measure these things very precisely, demanding that I be fired, and there were a whole bunch of letters from various people. I think, again, very bad faith readings of my columns, although, when you've written 1,000 columns, some of them are stupid. Certainly, many of them are stupid. But you say all kinds of things that, in hindsight, you shouldn't have said. I mean, I remember I used to go to Davos every year, and then I had a line in a column that said, I forgot about what, but I said something like, the tragedy of Davos is that nothing good that happens there is real, and nothing real that happens there is good, which I still thought was this kind of witticism written under deadline pressure, and it offended a lot of people. And I obviously regret it, and not just because I don't get invited to this stupid thing, but it was.
You were banished from the invite?
Apparently, I'm now back on the list.
Klaus, we'll write to Klaus.
Klaus likes me again. Mm-hmm. So lots of people wrote a petition demanding that I be fired. Or signed a petition demanding I be fired. One of them was an oceanographer named John Englander. And after he had signed this petition, he started reading me and thought, this guy is not so bad. So he cold called me. I forgot whether it was an email or how he got in touch with me, but basically out of the blue, and he said, look, I think you're actually a reasonable columnist. I think you're really wrong on climate. I want to take you to Greenland, and I want to show you that you're wrong. And I thought, well, number one, junket to Greenland. I mean, I'm a journalist. How can I say no to a quality junket? Number two, maybe I am wrong, and what's the harm in testing my views? So I agreed to this. This was in 2019. The pandemic got in the way, and then last summer, we went up. And so Carol and Dr. Mark Sontag are here. They were on the trip. And you know, people can say, well, you should have known, but it is an overpowering experience when you look at what's called the trim line, which is seeing, it's kind of like the bathtub rings in Lake Mead, seeing just how much ice the ice sheet has receded. And if you draw the circumference of Greenland, it is a huge amount of ice. Now, my mind had, in fact, already been changing before then, not on account of climate, but on account of the pandemic. Because much of my thinking about climate wasn't really about the question of whether there was anthropogenic climate change. I was perfectly willing to accept that. The question for me was, what is the risk, and how much should we invest in mitigating a risk that is a 50 or 100-year, question? And should we invest now, or should we invest in 100 years when we're that much richer? That really was the nature of my problem with a lot of climate activism. I was saying, you're investing in a lot of immature technologies that's going to be misspent. Then the pandemic occurred, and I thought, you know what? Nature has a way of overwhelming even ingenious human systems, whether they're public health systems or whatever, in ways that are unpredictable, rapid, and devastating. And so if I learned anything about the pandemic, it was to have a more humble approach to the question of risks which are not certainties, but whose consequences are so devastating that you have to think of them in a much more sober and proactive way. And that combination of factors changed my mind. And then a matter of writing about it was not hard. It's a wonderful thing to say, I was wrong. It cleans your soul. You just say, yeah, I got this wrong. And maybe it's a model for other people, because I'm sure that everyone in this room is wrong about something. What that is, I don't know, but you're wrong about something.
So one of the things you wrote in that piece in October was, for anyone who has entertained doubts about the warming of the planet, a trip to Greenland serves as a bracing corrective. Now, we can't all go to Greenland, Bret, and you know who else can't go to Greenland? Like all the people on Capitol Hill who are blocking meaningful reforms in legislation. So what are we going to do in the absence of that? They can go, actually, but they don't. They won't, right? Because it's become like because the climate change has been associated now with the Democrats, right? And so how do we depolarize this critical issue? One of the people that you write admiringly about sometimes is, of course, George Shultz, who's an icon here, iconic figure. And one of the stories he used to tell on campus a lot was when he was in Washington and they were dealing with the ozone. And he would see these skeptics about the hole in the ozone, and he would say, maybe you're right. But just in case you're wrong, let's take out an insurance policy. Right? And he was able at that time to convince the skeptics. How are we going to do that now?
Well, I mean, one of the people I interviewed in my piece on climate was Seth Klarman, who's one of the great hedge fund managers of our time. And, conservatives, certainly libertarian-minded conservatives who are thoughtful about various kinds of risk and hedging, could be thoughtful about this as well. I mean, as a matter of fact, I think back to Dick Cheney, who after 9/11 said, if there's even a 2% chance that the bad guys could get a nuclear weapon, we have to go to extreme lengths to prevent that from happening. So even to a climate skeptic, I would say if there's even a 2% chance that you're wrong, the risks are so catastrophic that maybe you should start hedging. I do think that the conversation is not helped when people who are climate activists say, not only do we know what the problem is, but we are fully in charge of what the solution is. The solution has to be open for discussion and debate. And the truth is, a lot of climate activists have been wrong about solutions. I remember 20 years ago, people talked a lot about biofuels, right? Wood chips and ethanol and sugarcane and all this stuff. Hang on a second, turns out it's actually a terrible idea, hugely polluting, strips the land of vital foodstuffs, probably caused the Arab Spring because food prices started to rise as we moved our crop from producing food to producing fuel. For a long time, the environmental movement was dead set against nuclear technology. Well, it turns out, I think any thoughtful person would admit that nuclear power probably is one piece of an overall solution to climate. And I think the way in which we should be approaching the climate issue is saying, let's place 1,000 medium-sized bets and let the market figure out what's sensible. Largely let the market figure out what's sensible. I'm not against all forms of government regulation. And let's include Republicans in this conversation because after all, the chief conservative belief is that every generation has a fiduciary responsibility to subsequent generations, right? I mean, if a conservative thinks of, supposedly a good conservative thinks of nothing else, it's what do I owe my children and my grandchildren? Yet on this subject of climate, the answer is, well, nothing, right? Who cares? It's a bogus scare. It's a bunch of liberal hooey. We have to find a way of changing the conversation so thoughtful conservatives can actually be a part of a solution. What you have now is this total mental block. The minute the word climate comes up, 95% of Republicans, their mind simply shuts down, and that's not acceptable.
Maybe you can go around the country and write columns and talk to the hunters.
To whom?
The hunters. There's like this sort of trope in the climate report. Like, well, the hunters know. They know how things are being affected, and you don't use the word climate, right? And you're, a conservative, so they'll listen to you. Like, do a little climate tour. I just think that we don't center this issue enough in our conversation. You quipped in one of your columns about, the Air Force acquired this new bomber, and we didn't even know about it, this really expensive, magnificent piece of machinery, and because all we talked about was Elon buying Twitter. Yeah. We don't center the right things that matter. And you, as one of the most influential columnists in America, have enormous power to fix that.
Well, that's one of the things that I actually try to do. I feel like being a columnist is kind of like tenure. And I should be, I don't need to chase clicks. I want to write about things that matter to me. I mean, I grew up in Mexico City. 6 months ago, the president of Mexico started gutting the core institution that has guaranteed clean elections in Mexico for the last 25 years. Nobody was writing about it. I thought, I don't care. This matters. I wrote a column that got nowhere in the United States in terms of, because we measure, readership. But where it made a real difference? It made a difference in Mexico. Because the New York Times was paying attention to something that was happening in Mexico where the institutions of clean government and democracy, transparent government and democracy, were being actively harmed. So I do try to just choose topics that I think matter and count. And I know that every time I write the conversation with Gail, we'll get 1 million people reading it. So the gods of search engine optimization are happy with me. I don't really have to worry about it. I want to write about things that matter and that move the needle.
So, all right, I'm going to ask this one. I didn't really want to bring them up, but here we are. So, in November, you wrote a column, and the headline was "Donald Trump is finally finished." What? Now, and you went on and you said, no, I know people are not going to, I've said, but this was after the midterms, granted, now we're 6 months later or whatever, and you're like, no, I'm right, I know, I'm right. There was not that much humility in that one particularly. But someone's asking here, Who has the best chance of taking the oath of office in January 2025? So do you really think now that Donald Trump is finally finished?
Yeah, that was a really stupid column. As I've been telling you all along, I've written some bad ones. And look, I had written that because I thought, okay, after that midterm loss, when history, the cyclical nature of American elections, everything suggested a big Republican blowout. The Republicans barely took the House, failed to take the Senate because the candidate quality was just disastrous, whether it was Blake Masters in Arizona or Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania or Herschel Walker, of course, in Georgia. Surely Republicans want power more than they want Trump. But the Republican Party, and I say this as a guy who never voted for a Democrat until I could not believe it. I pulled the lever for Hillary Clinton in 2016 and again for Joe Biden in 2020. I actually took my daughters to watch me pull the lever for Hillary. I couldn't believe I was doing that. The Republican Party in its current incarnation has become a cult. And it's a cult centered around, and we've seen in history, Shabtai Zvi, like you can go back to various cult figures throughout the ages where even when it becomes clear they're not the Messiah, people follow them for reasons that can't be found in ordinary politics. They're a matter of a kind of psychology, or I would say almost a psychosis. And this goes back to what we were saying originally. I always think of myself as a conservative with peculiarities, but I really believe that every healthy democracy needs a healthy conservative movement. Don't need you to agree with it. I just need a conservative movement that when it elects a president, that person isn't crazy. That person is going to respect the four corners of the constitutional order. That person is going to respect the role of the free press. That person is going to understand what civil liberties are about, or at least understand, what the bedrock of what American society should be about, which is an open, tolerant, optimistic society. And I feel my role as a conservative columnist is to maintain that idea alive while the party that traditionally has represented conservative ideas is on a long, strange trip, and a very dangerous trip. Because, I don't want to I don't like the comparisons of Trump to Hitler, or, I think those are vastly overblown. But there is a fascistic conspiratorial streak coursing through the Republican Party that is frightening and dangerous, and it's bad, never mind for the conservative movement, it's bad for Democrats. When Democrats were secretly supporting Trumpian candidates in primaries, I thought it was shameful behavior. They did it because they thought, okay, we can win against these more extreme characters, but sometimes you don't win.
And it's a risk.
You want a Republican Party that you can live with. You want a Republican Party that says, okay, we're for free markets, less regulation, less taxes, whatever it is, okay? And you might disagree with it, but you think, these are people with whom I can break bread. And we're running away from that. So I want to maintain an idea of what a conservative should be, and hopefully in 10 or 15 years, people say, you weren't wrong about everything.
So back in I think it was 2016, Jay, we had a Department of Communication event on how to cover Trump. So that was 7 years ago. We're still discussing this question this week because of the town hall that CNN had. So this is going to be a consequential journalism decision again. How should the mainstream media cover Trump?
Well, unfortunately, we have to cover him as the presumptive Republican frontrunner.
Within that, there's a lot of nuance of how to do it.
And so I was going to add, but it doesn't mean that we have to pick up and be hysterical when he baits us. Mm-hmm. And look, who is Trump? Trump is a genius 8th grade bully. We all remember the 8th grade? Think of the bully in the 8th grade. That is Trump. or whatever, 5 years ago. That's who he is. And his genius, and it is a kind of reptilian genius, is to bait people where he knows they become neuralgic and enraged. So we don't have to pick up on his every Truth Social post. He doesn't have to dominate all of the news coverage. We should be giving respectful attention to other Republican candidates, whether it's Tim Scott or Nikki Haley or, yes, Ron DeSantis. But we don't need to play quite by his rules in the way we did in 2016.
So there's a question here about the diversity or perhaps lack of diversity in some of the voices in the Times opinion pages. We often assume a very naive framework of opinion journalism. It stirs debate, challenges orthodoxy, and induces persuasion. But many critics argue that the boundaries of debate themselves restrict essential and even popular perspectives. One might note, for example, the dearth of socialist or Palestinian voices in the Times opinion pages. Why do you think such perspectives are so often excluded?
You have to come from some corner of the political world to think there's a dearth of pro-Palestinian or socialist voices in the New York Times. But I guess how you see it depends on where you stand politically. I mean, there are pro-Israel activist groups that take out large billboards denouncing the Times, and the billboards are directly across the office of the publisher, so that he can see it. Look, I think it is. There's no perfect science to how you create a menu of columnists that is perfectly representative, and the Times is a proudly liberal paper. It has always had one or two conservative voices on it, but it has always essentially been a left of center news organization. And I mean this mainly with opinion, but to some extent the news pages. I think actually the Times could benefit from having a slightly Trumpier voice.
Really?
Yes. Because the truth is, who do I represent in the conservative world? I represent like 7 people, and some of them are one of them.
One
is
of them
my
is David
mother.
Brooks. You basically have the same biography, right?
David has basically become kind of a center-left guy. David French, my new. I mean, I say this very respectfully. I think David's a great columnist, but I think his politics are
No, it's moved. It's moved.
A few points to the left of center. David French is sort of where I am. But we do not expose our readers to, say, Christopher Caldwell as a kind of intelligent but sort of Trumpy guy who's several points to the right of me. The Washington Post does this with Mark Thiessen. I know a lot of people tear their hair out about Mark Thiessen, but if you want that point of view, he is offering it. And there is a kind of a danger for Times readers that we become sort of a readership of Pauline Kael. I don't know if you remember, but Pauline Kael was the famous film critic of whom it is said that in 1972, after Nixon won the biggest landslide in American history, she said, "How could Nixon have won? All my friends voted for McGovern," right? So I think the Times could do a little better in alerting our readers to what at least 45% of the country thinks.
So hey, say you put a Trumpy commentator in there. How do you get the Times readers then to read that Trumpy commentator?
Because as I know from reading my comments, there's some kind of morbid, masochistic streak in so many people that you read things that you know you shouldn't.
Okay. Somebody asks if you would have published the Tom Cotton piece.
Oh, I said not.
You maybe give a little background on that whole. You referred to the debacle, but.
I wrote a column denouncing the Times' decision, which, to the Times' credit, they published. In 2020, Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed called "Bring Out the Troops," calling for National Guard troops to deal with protests and rioting in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. The Times had published several pieces opposing that view, but the idea was we wanted James Bennett, the then editorial page editor, had been given the job to mix it up and shock Times readers with contrary points of view. So we got Tom Cotton. At the time, Cotton's view was, by some polls, a majority view in the United States. Published this opinion piece. There was a gigantic upsurge of a revolt in the newsroom of the Times. Again, one of the evils of Twitter, people retweeting, this piece, I think the line was, "This piece puts Black lives in danger." And after initially a kind of a weak defense of the decision to publish, the piece was retracted, and James Bennett was fired, and his deputy was demoted. And I think that was a low point I wrote this, so I'm going to say it. I think it was one of the worst decisions I've seen in management in a long time. Not only because James Bennett is a fine editor and writer with a distinguished career who did not deserve to be fired, certainly not over that, but it sent a signal that for writers and editors that you have to watch your back or you have to watch where you step because there's always going to be a landmine. And this is one of the things, we haven't actually, to my surprise, used these words, cancel culture. But it is a thing it is a fear that haunts a lot of people. Not so much the cancellation, the culture. A handful of people get canceled, many people get silenced by the culture that exists around the prominent cancellations. And cancel culture does not happen when an online mob forms saying, "Fire James Bennett." It happens when people in charge lose their nerve. And I feel whether it's in academia or in the media or other institutions, what's desperately needed to help create braver conversations is leadership that says, we're not going to cancel you. Right now there's a petition. You mentioned that I'm going to be the graduation speaker at Chicago. There's a petition being signed by lots of people denouncing, the Students for Justice in Palestine and the Democratic Socialists are circulating this petition, and so far a few hundred people have signed it.
They don't wait to come.
Knock on wood, but Chicago is not going to cancel me because Chicago does not cancel. And that is a hugely affirming signal to people to have the courage to think out loud. And that's what great institutions in a liberal world do. They let you think aloud. Because if you can't speak freely, you won't be able to think clearly. The inability to test your thoughts, even your mistakes, in conversation means that you're going to become a victim of a kind of a doublethink, a kind of muddled soup in your mind where you don't quite know what to think because you're afraid of what to say. And that's, I think, a real danger at the heart of a real threat to democracy today. So many people are terrified that a bad comment is going to haunt them forever. And that has to stop. And it only stops when leadership says, we're not going to allow it to happen. So-and-so said something bad, you feel sorry about it, end of story. End of story, because we are not in the business of annihilating people for testing their views. We are in the business of talking to them. Conversation is what makes democracy, whether it's an agreement or disagreement. It's what makes us able to say yes and no, to have thinking that moves things forward. In science, we all accept that trial and error is essential to the scientific enterprise. It's also essential to the liberal enterprise that you should be able to have a conversation with someone, say something stupid, and the person says, you might reconsider for these reasons. And you'll go, huh. And maybe you'll change your mind. That can't happen when you're too afraid to open your mouth in the first place. So I just urge all of you, this is the greatest university west of the Mississippi.
Coast. East Coast elite comment there.
No, I'm a Midwestern elitist. You have such a responsibility here to make that happen. Sorry for the...
No, it's a good discussion on that topic. You had another column, I know you said not to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway, that said that, quote, wokeness will fail.
Yeah.
And I hated that you used that word to describe the issue. I felt, and I just want to talk about why you used that. I mean, you made your argument in the Bret Stephens way, but why that word has become, it's like a word they throw around on Fox News, right?
Look, we are all prisoners of words that are fundamentally, words and phrases in terms that are fundamentally imprecise. I mean, what the word liberal means in the United States is very different from what it means in Australia. A liberal in Australia is a conservative in the United States, right? Or in the Netherlands. Wokeness is a term that people get, right? And if you look at that, I actually offered I think a fairly useful...
You gave a good definition.
A definition of it.
Yeah.
And I understand that what it began as, right, being awake to the reality of primarily racial injustice, but other forms of injustice in society, has been transmogrified into a kind of social movement / attitude, right, that views America and political life through the prism of systems of interlocking oppression that have to be dismantled through a variety of mechanisms, some of them with a slightly Orwellian tint, like redefining words so that, you know, if someone says unhoused, right, as opposed to homeless, you're entering into a world of wokeness. So, but I wanted to talk about why, if I may, why I think it's going to fail. There are two kinds of social movements, I think, in the United States. There are movements that seek to fulfill the promise of the Declaration about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and there are movements that essentially reject it. So every successful social movement in the United States, whether it was abolitionism, suffrage, civil rights, marriage equality, that based itself on the idea of a more perfect union, of building, of bringing the United States closer to its foundational promise, has succeeded. But there have been another set of movements, right? Various forms of white separatism, black separatism, movements that fundamentally say the United States is founded on lies. Nation of Islam is another example that comes to mind, and the early thinking of Malcolm X. All of those movements fail. And I think the problem that you have with wokeness is, or whatever term you want to use, okay, with this kind of thinking, is that I don't think it looks at the United States and says there is an inherent promise in this nation which is noble, and that every generation has the responsibility of redeeming and expanding and fulfilling that mission. What it really is too often saying is everything about America is rotten. In the 1960s, it was America with a K at the end, the suggestion it was a Nazi society. All of that basically failed, but the people who do succeed, in my view, aren't progressive or radical opponents of the system. They are thoughtfully minded liberals or often conservatives who want to say, what the United States is can be made better, and that wonderful expression, a more perfect union, the kind of teleological sense that American identity is what we're going towards, not what we're coming from, that's what succeeds. Those are the movements that end up working out in the long term.
Yeah, no, and that's, I mean, the argument was very, very compelling, and so I just feel like when you put that word, like, sometimes I wonder, and we talk about this sometimes, the headlines can alienate the people you're trying to reach. So I just wondered about, what do we call the movement to harass school board members and remove books from libraries in Florida that deal with LGBTQ and all that kind of silencing?
Fascism.
Fascism. So I'm going to end on time. So I'm going to end with you, Rebecca Goldsmith, on a positive note here. So there are people who aspire to write, there are business people, there are others outside of journalism. So what actionable tips do you have for people who want to write and publish on a topic they feel passionate about?
Well, know something about it. Passion is not enough. Let me actually just offer a tip to people who just want to write in general. I learned to write by choosing a number of writers I admired and imitating them. And by failing to imitate them well, I discovered my own voice. And I think real originality actually begins as an active imitation that goes progressively off course until you find who you are as a writer, as a voice. I think it's really useful to have heroes in terms of your writing. I don't know if it's Joan Didion or if you're an essayist or Susan Sontag. I can think of lots of people who you might choose to emulate. And then really ask yourself, well, how do they do that? I used to look at certain writers I admired and say, well, why did he finish his paragraph there, right? Or why so many short sentences? And what is the value of that staccato quality to the writing? And when is it good to have a short sentence be followed by a long one? And how do you make that work? What is the architecture, literally, of the piece? How many paragraphs are contained? I would count how many paragraphs are contained in it. And so you really kind of look at people you admire and you say, okay, this is actually a mechanism. It's like an engine or even a Lego that has been put together in a certain kind of way. How do they do that? Really ask yourself that question. The second thing I really urge people to do is memorize poems. There's no substitute for memorization. Memorize them and say them out loud. I mean, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? I mean, I can go on, right? But you suddenly understand that language can be gorgeous and can have the quality of seeing a beautiful scenery in Northern California. That discipline of really thinking about language will make you a good writer over time. And of course, whatever Malcolm Gladwell says, 10,000 hours or whatever, that's kind of true too. You get good at it simply by doing it for years and then suddenly discovering one day it's second nature.
Get your reps, as I tell my students. Well, I apologize to the people whose questions on the cards I didn't get to. We didn't talk about the geopolitics. I could have done all night on Russia and, of course, Israel, but luckily Bret's written extensively on all the foreign policy topics. And I commend you all to read from his new journal, Sapir, where he has a new essay about sketching out a new kind of Israel geopolitical vision for the country, which is excellent. So please join me in thanking Bret Stephens for joining us.